This is SRM Insider.
Hello and welcome to SRM Insider. My name is Kyle Schwaeble.
And I'm James Tytler.
And we both work on SRM's incident response team. In just a bit, we'll also be joined by two special guests, and we'll be diving into some interesting topics, including how insurers are looking to grow their cyber books globally, some of the unique challenges of cyber incident response, and the value of teamwork when it comes to responding to incidents. James, it's really great to speak to you again. I know you've been pretty busy lately.
Yep. Likewise, Carl. I've been dealing with a lot of incidents recently, but what about you? I know you've been pretty busy in Asia recently.
Yeah, it's been an exciting time. I mean, as you know, SRM, we recently launched our cyber team in Asia for the first time. So we've been pretty busy setting that up, and we've actually been responding to a few incidents in the region. And we've got offices in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Kuala Lumpur. So yeah, it's been really exciting, but also quite an intense period. But yeah, looking forward to seeing what comes from that.
Absolutely, great stuff. So why don't we kick off by discussing some of the key trends we've been seeing over the last year?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, for the listeners out there, I mean, unfortunately, we're still seeing the frequency of ransomware attacks trending upwards. Most of these, from what I've been seeing, seem to be targeting the smaller to medium-sized businesses. And unfortunately, healthcare and financial services, as well as construction sectors, seem to be the ones that are most targeted. Unfortunately, healthcare and financial services seem to be, that's a consistent trend we've seen for the last few years. But on the positive side, we have seen quite a lot of success with some law enforcement operations against some of these ransomware syndicates.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, 2023 was a bumpy year for ransomware attacks, and indications certainly are that trend is continuing into 2024. So last year, we found that the number of organizations posted on dark web leak sites had increased by 70% from the previous year, to a record high of 4,611 organizations. But we know that the true scale of the problem is likely much worse. So our own data from 2023 showed that 37% of the victims we responded to never actually appeared on the leak site, despite not paying a ransom. So, I mean, if we extrapolate those numbers, it suggests that the total number of victims from last year is probably significantly higher. And this upward trend has also continued into 2024. So from January to March, the numbers of victims posted were 16% higher than the same period in 2023. And for last month, April, there was a 13% increase on the previous month, and a 23% increase on April 2023.
Yeah, it's just, it's nonstop. There's no signs of this slowing down at all. And I mean, I think ransomware is still going to continue to be the threat, at least in the next few years. But as I said, it's not all bad news. There has been quite a lot of success recently with some law enforcement operations that have taken down some really major ransomware groups, actually. One of them over the past year was Black Cat, that was targeted by the FBI at the end of 2023, in December 2023. And then there was also Operation Kronos, which was led by the FBI, but also the UK's NCA, which targeted Lockbit, the most prolific and notorious ransomware group out there. That operation took place in February. And I mean, the biggest news really that came out this week was the recent sanctions designations against the prominent Lockbit members, including the group's supposed leader, an individual named Dmitry Koroshev. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I mean, the law enforcement and the sanctions authorities are claiming that he is the individual behind the online persona Lockbit Sup, which essentially claims to be leading the Lockbit operation. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see other affiliates of Lockbit targeted or even sanctioned in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think neither operation put an immediate stop to either of these groups' activities, but it's pretty clear now down the line that neither of them are major players anymore. We saw Lockbit last year consistently. They were the most active group in terms of the numbers of victims being posted to their dark web leak site, but those numbers have really dropped off dramatically since the operation. So the NCA, for example, has reported that the number of monthly Lockbit attacks has reduced by 73% in the UK since the takedown. And yeah, as you said, I think that sanctions designation is really going to have a massive impact on Lockbit. I think, any entity with a US footprint is really going to be reluctant to pay any sort of ransom. And Black Cat, again, it's interesting. They set up a new leak site after the seizure, but shortly afterwards performed an exit scam and allegedly pocketed a $22 million ransom before disappearing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think it goes beyond just the US. I think, just from our experience, I'm sure you'll agree that organizations globally, really, sanctions and US sanctions in particular are a major concern for them. So now the fact that, the supposed leader of Lockbit has been sanctioned, it'll be really interesting to see how the market responds to that. I mean, I know certainly from SRM's perspective, it'll be quite a challenge to be able to justify making ransom payments going forward to Lockbit. And, if that group's not receiving any funds, which I suspect will likely be the result of these sanctions, the sanctions that have been imposed, if they're not receiving any funds, then, how long can they really last? So I wouldn't be surprised if we see Lockbit falling away in the near future. But as we know from prior experience, that doesn't last very long, and we'll probably see the same individuals and criminals behind these attacks pop up under different monikers and working under the umbrella of different groups. So yeah, it might have a short-term disruption, probably will, but I think in the long term, ransomware will still continue to be the major threat. Well, why don't we move on and introduce our two guests today. So we're very pleased to be joined today by two good friends of SRM, and I think both very respected leaders in their fields. Firstly, Liam Cattermole-Ward. He's the senior claims adjuster at Munich Re. He's responsible for large single risk insurance clients across multiple jurisdictions and reinsurance clients in the UK and US, as well as across the Asia Pacific region, Africa, and the Middle East. Liam has over 16 years of insurance experience, and with 6 of those being spent in senior cyber claims roles. Thanks for joining us, Liam.
Thanks, Carl. Good to be here.
And next, but absolutely not least, Rose Amin is a partner at Clyde Co in London. She's widely considered to be an expert in cybersecurity, data protection, and breach incident response, and James and I have been fortunate enough to have witnessed that firsthand. Rose advises on breach response incident claims and helps companies navigate their strategic and regulatory response in the UK and internationally. She also helps organizations prepare for a cyber incident through workshops and simulation exercises. And Rose also has direct experience working with insurers and regularly advises on policy wording and claims under cyber policies. So it's great to have you join us as well today, Rose.
Thanks for having me.
So, Rose, I think we've just had a brief overview of kind of what we've been seeing at SRM over the last 12 months. I think one of the main things that we're seeing is those law enforcement takedowns. I'm just wondering, looking forward, what do you see on the horizon coming out of that?
Yeah, thanks, James. I found the insight you guys provided really helpful. I think with the law enforcement takedowns we saw towards the end of last year with Black Cat and Alfie with the FBI, I think we're going to be seeing more of that and coordinated attacks by law enforcement authorities. For example, the FBI worked with other jurisdictions to take Black Cat down. I think as a consequence of that, we're also going to be seeing more lone wolf attacks. And I know we've seen some of those together with SRM working on certain cases. We've seen a threat actor, Yolanda, Aegis, Verada, threat actor groups we've not typically seen in the hundreds and hundreds of incidents we've worked on, but they're popping up. There's a question to be asked whether they're just a different version of Black Cat and Lockbit and other threat actor groups taken down, but it's certainly seeing more of them in the next 12, 18 months. And I think what that means from a legal perspective and as Breach Incident Counsel is it's making attribution harder for us and for the organization as we talk to them and they ask, who are we dealing with here? And we say, they call themselves Aegis Verada, they call themselves Yolanda, but we don't quite know who's really behind it. And so as attribution makes it harder, it makes it more difficult to understand their modus operandi, the likely risk factors they might be facing, such as re-extortion, because we don't really know who we're dealing with. And it also complicates the assessment from a legal perspective when we're assessing the legality of, say, a ransomware payment or steps that we should be taking. So I think that's something we're likely to see in the next 12, 18 months.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And just from a technical vendor's point of view, from a DFIR perspective, you touched on it as well. It makes it more difficult to sort of predict the behaviors of these smaller groups, and that complicates both containment and restoration strategies, but also actually makes the forensic investigation slightly more tricky because we don't have those standard tactics, techniques, and procedures or indicators of compromise that we can rely on in our forensic investigations to speed those processes up. So I absolutely agree. I think that's going to complicate both, the technical side of the response, but also a lot of the sort of more legal and regulatory aspects of a response as well. Thanks, Rose. And Liam, what about you? I mean, I think there seems to be a bit more of a general push to grow cyber insurance books, and this obviously will bring a lot more risk to insurers. Is there anything that you're keeping a particularly keen eye on over the next 12 months?
I think for me, it's we all sort of pretty comfortable by now, I think, of the sort of first party element of the cyber risk. But I think it's what's keeping me awake at the moment certainly is the way the third party litigations are going to go, particularly over the next 12 to 18 months. We're seeing a much more bigger uptake in terms of group litigation, class actions, particularly in the US. The whole mass arbitration thing has sort of blown up, and I think it's a very interesting time. And with some of these regulatory and legal changes that are coming in, that could make the sort of third party element, a lot more topical, I think, over the next few years.
Yeah, and it kind of ties in a little bit to that ever growing supply chain risk that we're seeing as well, and the threat to supply chains, and how these groups, particularly ransomware groups, are targeting very often managed service providers who are looking after multiple different clients. That could have an impact on a lot of organizations at once, and there could be many claims coming off the back of that as well. So yeah, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. James, I think you had a question for Liam around cyber insurance and the growth.
Yes, Liam, I was wondering if you could speak to the general state of the cyber insurance market. I mean, I remember when I became aware of this industry a few years ago, that it was generally considered that the market was quite tight. It was quite difficult for companies to actually get hold of cyber insurance. I wonder if that situation's changed at all.
I think there's still elements of it. I think everyone's still getting to grips with the product. I mean, we keep talking about cyber as if it's this long established thing, but in insurance terms, it's certainly the newest type of product out there in terms of it's only been around 20 odd years at sort of most. So it's a real newbie in the world of insurance when you think back to the sort of marine days and everything else. So I think there is that perception that there is limited capacity perhaps in the market. But when you look at the sheer full of spread that everyone is trying to sort of either enter the cyber insurance market, or there's everyone's talking about growth. So I think it's not necessarily now an issue for carriers. It's more of client and insured education, uninsured education, because as we all know, businesses are I think anecdotally I saw something like 15% of businesses purchase cyber insurance globally. So you look at the untapped element there. I think the growth is huge, but I think the concern probably for the market at the moment is growing A, at a sensible rate, and B, making sure that the underwriting is sound and the actual risk appetite is correct, because it's an ever evolving landscape. So I think that's the biggest challenge for the market at the moment.
That's really interesting, Liam. And I mean, it certainly aligns with a lot of the conversations I've been having over the last few months with insurers. And I mean, you're right. Everybody is talking about their sort of growth ambitions and trying to grow their books dramatically. Where do you think insurers will, obviously it's a bit of a generalization, but where do you think insurers will be looking to grow these books the most? I mean, are there specific jurisdictions or sectors that may look more appealing than others?
I think globally as a whole, I think is that everyone's looking at growth globally, but I think in terms of key jurisdictions, you're talking sort of APAC, Asia Pacific, particularly Asia. I think that's a particularly in terms of product and sort of purchasing, it's probably the biggest growth area we've seen in a while. So I think that's definitely a key focus, certainly for us.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it as well. I mean, and from the conversations I've been having with insurers out in Asia, it definitely seems to be an effort in education, sort of educating the market, educating, like you say, uninsureds on the value of cyber insurance, but also on the cyber risk, really, and the threat that they're facing. I'm confident that I think over the next few years that education will start to pay off, and we'll start to see the market grow dramatically in Asia. But I also think we'll probably see renewed threat and sort of focus by a lot of these cyber criminal groups in the region as well as that growth takes place. Rose, do you have anything to add on the Asia market specifically and insurance in Asia?
Yeah, I think that was a really good point that both of you made. And I think, Liam, just picking up on your point on Asia being a growth market, I know that I came across an article that Munich Re issued, and they noted that the growth opportunities of cyber insurance in Asia and the market size is expected to triple by 2025. So we're thinking about that market tripling and what Kyle was saying about educating and it evolving. And I think compared to Europe as well, the US, the cyber insurance is comparably a new product for Asia. You talked about how the cyber insurance market is no more than 20 years old. But I think that's very much, the experience of us in this part of the world. But I think in Asia, it's still a new experience, and the take-up is gaining momentum given the different stages of development. And I think as the growth of cyber in Asia grows, we will see the threat actor landscape also evolve, sometimes differently. I know, Kyle, we've sat down with certain reinsurers interested in India, for instance, and I think all that interest we're seeing, not just from insurers, but reinsurers as well, will be growth parallel to the data privacy regime in Asia. So, for example, in August last year, India, the world's largest democracy, passed the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. And this follows China passing their data privacy laws in 2021. Both countries, massive in terms of population and growth opportunities. So I think as the cyber insurance market looks for opportunities to grow, we need to keep an eye on the regulatory landscape and the risks arising, because, the way we've seen threat actors double down in ransomware attacks and stealing data, being part of the tactic, is really off the back of them understanding that organizations have obligations to notify and them understanding the value of data. And so as the opportunities develop in Asia, we need to keep a close eye on the data protection regimes, because are we going to see a similar story developing in Asia as we've seen in other parts of the world? So, that's my 2 cents on that.
That's incredibly interesting, and I mean I agree with you. And it's actually, we see it ourselves. I mean, when we're doing incident response work in Singapore, where there is that notification obligation in the event of a data breach, organizations have to notify a regulator and possibly also data subjects that may be impacted. The level and intensity of the response and sort of the requirements for the response are a lot more intense, and the response becomes a lot more complicated because of that aspect. Whereas if we look at some of the other jurisdictions in Asia where that notification obligation doesn't exist, the response is, I think, more focused on just getting systems back up and running, just restoring systems and minimizing business interruption, with less of a focus on the investigation and understanding, exactly what data may have been impacted or taken by the threat actor, just because those obligations don't exist. So, yeah, I agree. I can see the same thing happening, as these regulations get passed in these jurisdictions, and as they become sort of more sensitive to data privacy and the impacts of a data breach. I could see that threat actors will pick up on that, start targeting these organizations in these regions, looking to steal data and really benefit from the regulatory pressure that they will feel following a cyber attack. So yeah, really, really interesting points. Thanks a lot for that, Rose.
And one other thing I'm wondering about is, with all of these growth opportunities, is how insurers might be using new technologies like AI, for example, to help support some of these growth plans. I was wondering if Liam or Rose, you could speak to that.
I might go first, Liam. I just think it's really interesting. We've had lots of queries from insurers to understand how AI can both be a risk and opportunity for the market. I know that there are insurers out there that are underwriting cyber, amongst other business lines, using AI to assist in the underwriting process. and they have found that it's, a real driver for profitability, and it's also accurate. So that's one way we're seeing AI being used as an opportunity for insurers, but also being mindful of the risks it may present. Understanding that threat actors can use AI to automate the way they use that as a threat vector, and to promote attacks at a higher scale and volume. So that's a risk factor that insurers need to be aware of. And also the ever-evolving regulatory landscape. We need to bear that in mind as well. The EU AI Act has come into force. The UK has for now decided that it will not be implementing legislation, but rather embracing principles. But nevertheless, against the backdrop of a quickly evolving technology and a still evolving regulatory landscape, I think it's important to embrace the opportunities it can present, being mindful of the risks, but against the backdrop of a regulatory landscape which has a patchwork effect when you look at the UK, the EU, and other countries as well. It's not clear-cut. It's not, say, the GDPR, where there's one regime or similar regimes applying. So I think against as I said, the risks and opportunities, we need to keep an eye, again, on the regulatory landscape.
Yeah, that's interesting. Liam, I mean, any thoughts from you? Have you seen insurers utilizing some of this novel technology to support underwriting and the growth plans?
In terms of actually seeing underwriters utilize it, not yet. There's been a lot of talk about it. I think AI is that new hot topic for everyone. I think every sort of seminar or conference that I've been to has touched upon it at some point. And I'm probably going to be quite controversial here and say, is AI actually a cyber thing? Because I think a lot of insurers, are talking about cyber and focusing perhaps too much on the sort of cyber element, but AI can impact every line of business. When you boil it down, it's just another tool. We could be talking about stereotypical E&O claims that have been caused by AI rather than a pure cyber thing. So that's the thing that really interests me at the moment, is how, as a market, we're going to evolve. I mean, Munich Re had already sort of doing our own AI insurance policy, so it's something that's quickly evolving, and I think we need to have a much broader viewpoint on AI.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and I think you're right. I mean, every conversation you have today or listen in on today seems to discuss AI and the impact it's going to have on that particular sector. I mean, from cybersecurity point of view, I think we are seeing it play a role. I think there's probably been so far an overreaction on the threat it poses. I don't think it's necessarily revolutionizing the threat landscape, or we are seeing a bit more. We are seeing AI being used a bit more when it comes to sort of crafting phishing emails, and we're seeing a little bit more sophistication around that, which is increasing the threat and increasing the risk. But I wouldn't say sort of that's a dramatic increase. We're also seeing AI being used a little bit on the defensive side, looking to identify new threats and using technology to identify new threats in a breach, for example. But I think you're right, Liam. I don't think it's necessarily yet taken the industry by storm and completely changed the industry that we're operating in yet. But maybe in the next few years it will. Maybe we're speaking too soon.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that really interesting point that Liam made, that it's not just a cyber issue. And from a legal perspective, that's certainly what we're seeing. If I may, I think AI should be seen in the way silent cyber was seen a few years ago, meaning it may come up in different business lines, and certainly cyber, but we ought to pause and think about, is it a cyber issue? Does it sit somewhere else? And can it crop up in other business lines? And I just want to bring up a couple of examples. I'm not sure if you've heard of the Air Canada case, where an individual who sought reimbursement due to bereavement policy with the airline was conversing with the chat function. And when he sought to finally claim for that expense, Air Canada said basically, no, you can't. And because our chat GPT function was inaccurate, and ultimately made a claim in the small claims court tribunal in Canada and actually was successful. And the amount was ultimately relatively small. I think it was somewhere between $600 to $800. But ultimately, Air Canada was held liable and said, just because you rely on a third-party function like a chat function, which is, AI-powered, doesn't mean you can absolve yourself of liability. And in that case, they will held liable. Now, I don't think, as Liam said, I don't think AI is necessarily always a cyber issue. Could that just be a misrepresentation issue? But you can see how that liability risks arises from a failure or misrepresentation or inaccuracies with a chat function. It's not specifically a cyber issue. It may feel like a cyber issue, but when you give it further thought, the liability that arises came from a misrepresentation or perhaps the product not performing in the way that it ought to. So it gives rise to very interesting legal issues as well. And just another example to pique your interest is that transaction, speaking of Asia and the risks, that transaction fraud payment in Asia and Hong Kong earlier this year, where an individual was tricked by AI deepfakes on Teams into making a payment of over $200 Hong Kong million, about 20.3 million pounds. And again, it feels like a cyber issue because it was an incident involving a payment diversion fraud via Teams, but there was no intrusion of their systems. The use of Teams was a legitimate use of Teams. It's just that every participant on it was an AI deepfake. So again, it feels like a cyber issue, doesn't it? Yeah. But is it a cyber issue? Was there an intrusion of a systems? And this is where scrutiny of the wording and what triggers a claim will be really important. Or is it a fraud claim that should fall under a crime policy rather than a cyber policy? So again, things that can feel like a cyber issue, and I think the point Liam made is a very good one, doesn't always mean it is, that it is. And I think we ought to think of AI as cropping up under different business lines in the way, we sort of silent cyber, it can come up anywhere, but it bears further scrutiny and you have to think about what the issue is.
Yeah, that's fantastic and a really, really interesting topic of discussion. Thank you so much, both. I want to move on just in the interest of time. James and I were having a discussion recently, and sort of one part of that's really stuck in my mind over the last few weeks is about how different a response can be for a large enterprise, sort of a potentially international response, or what is a really big, potentially publicly listed company, that suffers an incident. What the response for an organization like that looks like compared to a sort of response for a small or medium-sized business. It's just something that I've been grappling with and some of these key differences. So, Rose, in your role as breach coach, you obviously sit at the center of so many different types and sizes of incidents. One of the main differences that come to my mind between, let's say, a large enterprise response and let's call it an SME size response is the level of collaboration that's required between all of the different stakeholders, in a large incident. I think it's much higher level of collaboration. For you as a breach coach, who coordinating this entire incident, often sitting in that sort of quarterback role, what does good look like when it comes to collaboration, and what do you expect to see in particular when it comes to the interaction between technical vendors like SRM, for example, and the client and the client's team?
Yeah, I think from my perspective as breach counsel, it's really important for the client to understand where the data sits and which data might be impacted, especially for those international multi-jurisdictional breaches. Even where the systems locally are not impacted, you might have systems sitting in Asia or Australia or elsewhere in the world. If the jurisdiction suffering the impact of the incident, say the UK, includes employees or customers are more internationally facing, then there might be the issue of, are we going to have to notify regulators or individuals in other jurisdictions? And if the client has a good understanding of the employees, which pockets of data, where does it sit, what their obligations are with respect to certain clients, whether contractually or otherwise, it gives us a better roadmap into how we begin to prioritize and execute the relevant notification obligation. So that's key. Understanding, do you know where your data sits? Even if the systems overseas are not impacted, do you have data relating to other jurisdictions in the UK, for instance? And another is a point that you've mentioned, Kyle, the ability to dovetail and speak to the relevant counterparts in different jurisdictions is super important and key. Understanding how they all dovetail into each other and understand the roles they play. Because if they can do that well, and they understand that they need to work together, collaborate, and efficiently address certain issues, we're in a better position to manage downstream risks and take proactive steps. And what I mean by that is, if you have a good understanding of the employees and the stakeholders, you can identify any litigation risks or any third-party risks coming up in advance and manage them. You can also identify any supply chain issues and manage them ahead of time. So I think those are the two things that I would really identify as being important in those more international type breaches.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I agree. And Rose, I mean, in your role as breach coach, and obviously you're dealing often with partner law firms in other jurisdictions potentially, or sometimes even other DFIR vendors in these other jurisdictions, and they might be supporting different business units across the world for your client. How do you approach those challenges? In your role?
I think the most important thing that distinguishes one DFIR to another is the ability to understand the different roles that everyone plays. And I think this is something that SRM does really well, understanding the role of the insurer. If Liam's sitting on a claim, we have breach counsel. The insured organization themselves might have their preferred forensic vendor, and understanding the interplay of each person's role and not cutting across it, understanding that understandably breach counsel needs to be involved to maintain privilege and to lead on certain aspects. Having those discussions ahead of time, giving each other heads up and not cutting across each other, and seeking to be really collaborative. And I think that there is a tendency for people to cut across each other, and realistically, the organization is facing the worst day of their lives potentially. And so making sure that, everyone stays in their lane, but also collaborates and communicates clearly is so important to make sure there is a successful outcome, not just for the organization, but for the insurer as well, to understand the different issues coming up for them in parallel to the organization dealing with technical difficulties.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just looking at cyber insurance in general, I often hear people sort of talking about the value of cyber insurance is that you get access to all of these expert vendors, who do this day in, day out. But I actually think that an even bigger value of cyber insurance is that, yes, you get access to these expert vendors, but you also get access to these expert vendors that work together so regularly that they're actually one team. Like, Rose, the amount of cases that you and I have worked on, just the two of us, for example, I know how you operate and you know how I operate, but we also know what each other's looking for in the response. So ultimately, the client, the organization, the insured, is benefiting from that collaboration, and the efficiencies that we get in a response from the insurance-led response. So Liam, from your perspective, that's obviously an important part of an insurer's offering. The panel that they offer. But what do you typically look for when it comes to collaboration between your various vendors on the panel, legal counsel, DFIR firms, PR, etc.?
Well, I think, both of you just touched on some very, very key points. And whilst you're talking, I was just trying to put a number on the actual number of incidents Kyle, you, me, and Rose have probably worked on together in the past 3 years. It's got to be well into the sort of 30 plus that we've actually been involved in. And there's always, as you say, there's a common theme across those, which is collaboration. It's, but more importantly, with a simple goal or focus, that's the client and the insured at the sort of heart of, as Rose says, that they're at their darkest day and they need the support. But we all work sort of complementing each other, but also to make sure that their journey as the client is the smoothest as possible and pain-free. Because, when you look at like an SME type business, this could be game over for their company. We go into those initial breach calls, I think, collectively, and we never really know what's what until we're on that call. So you always go in prepared thinking for the worst case scenario. And I'd like to think 9 times out of 10 it's not so bad, and we generally can get through it relatively pain free. But most importantly, there's got to be trust with the parties involved as well, and this goes with insured-insurer relationship as well, right? I've never been a big fan of the whole term panel vendors, because it just seems to be more paint a picture of more services for hire. And what I've always felt it should be is it's a trusted partnership, because that's exactly what it is. I know there's a sort of perhaps a myth that insurers typically look to, avoid cover or shy away from their responsibilities, but I think that is very much just a stereotypical myth from other lines. But in cyber, insurers share that same goal as the client in terms of wanting to get them through and actually support them. And to your point, Kyle, about it's not just getting access to those experts, it's getting access to experts that work together, not just together, but with insureds and with insurers. And I think it's a very good mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know James wants to dive in with another question, but just one point I'd like to add is just how that comes, so how you see that in practice. Just a small example is, and I know that I would do this with Rose and vice versa, is if we have a significant finding, a new development that hasn't necessarily been shared with the sort of the response group, including the insured, it's a quick phone call just before that meeting that you're going to have, just to inform your counterpart at Rose, for example, about what you're about to update on. Can make sure that they're prepared to respond to that effectively as well, and they're not sort of being surprised on that call. And I think those small actions can help to build that trust and improve that collaborative relationship. But James, why don't I hand it back over to you? I know you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I think just picking up on something Liam said there as well about sometimes you go into these calls not really knowing like what the lay of the land is going to be, how intense the response is going to be. So I'm just wondering when we do end up dealing with that kind of worst case scenario, when we're dealing with a very intense breach, where a lot of resources needed. I'm just wondering how. From the legal team's perspective, Rose, how would you make sure that you can keep up that level of intensity and the responsiveness that's often required over a long period of time? I know we've had several cases where it's been very, very intense for over long periods.
Lots of coffee and chocolate is critical, of course, but I think it's also managing the cadence in a way that is sensible. So if we need resources, we can usually tell, having been involved in so many incidents where you need to pull in those resources. So if it happens on a bank holiday weekend, we know that the insured needs boots on the ground. It's about having those conversations offline and say, hey, what do you need? Do you need to reach out to partners and for me to reach out to my team? And I think we've been through surge events, right? Whether it's the MSPs, whether it's the MOVE-ITs or the Excellent breaches, where insurers expect us to be able to deal with these surges, making sure that we have the broader teams from a Clyde Co perspective. Having a cyber team and offices in 16 locations around the world, and with cyber incidents generally being jurisdictionally agnostic, we're able to pull in on a team to be able to resource them appropriately. I think what is important is once you have that team and being able to resource for the surge events is ensuring a smooth handover and continuity if you're having change in personnel, or making sure that everything is delivered in the way that an insured expects them to. So in the instance of, working with you guys, I know that there's usually a handover. We have conversation. Is someone stepping in here? Someone's going to be offsite there. And just to go back to the point that Kyle made and the one that Liam endorsed, it's not just about having a broad enough team, but a broad enough team that has the dynamic, trust, and workability to make sure that the level of service doesn't drop when there's a peak in work or when there's an expansion of the team, because we can pull 10 people in team at any time. But what the insurer and the insured expects is that we still deliver a service that they expect. And I think that handover, that conversation is what really makes the difference.
That's really interesting, Rose. And I think you touched on a few points there that could maybe introduce the elephant in the room, Liam, and that's around budgets, really. I mean, how do you as an insurer evaluate, what's an appropriate budget for a response, especially if we look at, large enterprise responses that often are extremely intense and do require a lot of resources at any one point versus maybe a smaller response that can maybe be handled by a smaller team? How do you evaluate those and the differences between the two?
Well, I mean, cheapest one wins, right? I'm joking. No, I mean, far from it. I think this is, there's a common theme across this, and trust and also transparency, I think, is paramount with these when looking at budgets, particularly because all that anyone wants, particularly insurers and more, and I'd say more so those clients and insureds who say have a particularly high self-insured retention. So they've got some skin in the game, so to speak, in terms of, they're looking at those costs. And it's not necessarily, okay, what's the cheapest option? It's got to be the right option, but also the budget needs to be clear and concise. It's never going to be perfect because we know those first few days of an incident, things change. You might have to change tactics or something, the threat actors might throw a curveball. So we know it's not an exact science, but fundamentally what budget should cover, are the key areas: containment, eradication, and recovery. You'd be surprised the amount that come through to insurers that don't have that, and that's even when you're dealing with sort of large incidences. You need, as an insurer, our job is to respond as quickly as possible. So rather than wasting time going back and forth over challenges with budgets and reporting, etc., it needs to be clear, and that's what I'm trying to sort of get it. And that when you're talking about good incident response budgeting, it's got to be coincide with a sensible timeline. It's to Rosa's point, you could throw 10 people at it, but are they the right 10 people, and do they have the dynamic and capabilities of dealing with the incident? So it should be clear and concise with a sensible timeline, which is weighted towards, say, the first two elements, the containment and eradication. Because what would stand out to me is if the budget came in and the vendors or the clients focused heavily on the recovery aspect, and they're missing that containment and eradication, because you have an overlap, a natural overlap, but the focus should always be containment, eradication, with recovery sort of on the horizon, because you could spend all that time recovering and then all of a sudden the threat actors are back in and you're back to square one. So I think that's kind of where I see it. So it's got to be completely clear from my perspective.
Yeah, I guess that those clear statements of work and budget estimates will give you the confidence, right, that the team that's being allocated towards this response are the appropriate team and are skilled enough to do it. And if it is 10 people, you'd expect ideally that those timelines will shorten and that the containment and eradication period will be a shorter period of time as opposed to potentially weeks on end. And we can then start looking at the recovery process quite quickly. So James, I mean, you're obviously in the coalface of incidents all the time, particularly in that containment and eradication phase that Liam's just been talking about now. As a sort of incident response lead at a DFIR vendor, what are the main differences for you when you and challenges as well, I guess, when looking at sort of those large enterprise responses that you've been dealing with, particularly over the last 2 to 3 months, and some of the smaller responses that you've had to handle?
I think that point that Liam raised about the importance of containment and eradication is a very interesting one there, because when you're talking about a larger enterprise, the business interruption, obviously the costs are potentially massive there. And the senior stakeholders' perspective is often that they want to get things up and running as quickly as possible. They want to get back to business as usual. So sometimes our role is to say that we need to structure this carefully. We do actually need to maybe go through a bit of pain initially to focus on that containment and eradication piece before we can actually get onto the restoration and going through that properly and getting back up to business as usual. So I think, us kind of arguing for that as the technical experts quite early on in the case, and kind of establishing our role to make sure that the recovery happens in a kind of safe and sustainable way, I think is very important. With a larger enterprise, because I think some of the dynamics obviously that you might expect dealing with a large response and a small response. Often you're dealing with in the case of a large enterprise, it's a company that has often quite a lot of technical expertise, maybe has experience dealing with crisis management. They maybe have some of those roles defined already. In a way that a smaller, an SME might not. With an SME, you might need a lot more hand-holding and guidance in terms of, technical, not just the technical response, but also just general crisis management. They may need a lot more of that kind of, white glove guiding them through something that's very out of the ordinary for them. Whereas with a larger enterprise, some of those roles may be a bit more established. That can mean that our role as DFR vendor is a bit more, well defined. We're going to slot in as the technical advisor, the technical expert. But that does also mean on the flip side that we have to kind of assert ourselves sometimes when we think that, that we want to make sure that things are happening and in a safer way as possible. We provide our guidance on what we think, the securest way to make sure that the recovery is done safely in the long term. I think ultimately, we always seek to minimize the operational disruption, regardless of the size of the client. But with these larger companies, the time frames that for that disruption to be allowed are often a lot tighter. We need to be very careful and clear about what our recovery plan is. Defining that, providing regular metrics and regular updates. I think that's one of the other key differences is that when you're dealing with a larger enterprise, particularly a listed company, they will have external stakeholders that may not be part of those regular calls, but they'll be wanting regular updates. You're talking about shareholders, particularly boards of directors. So that means that the intensity for us is often a lot higher because we need to make sure that not only are we doing the work and that's going on in the background, but we also need to be putting together regular updates. I think coming back to what Rose said as well, it's about making sure that we can flex in the right resources as necessary. It's not just a case of throwing more bodies at the problem and billing more. That's never the right answer. We need to make sure that we have the right people, that we're strategizing, that we're building the right team, and that we have an element of redundancy in that. When you're dealing with a very complex case, there's often a lot of moving parts. So when you have a handover, it can be quite complicated if people don't have the necessary context. You need to make sure that people are brought in at the right time, that people are able to kind of pass that baton on, especially if we're talking about teams picking up across different time zones, and that's something that we do as well. To just make sure that we have, the ability to maintain that momentum and the pace that's necessary when you're dealing with a response to a breach at a large enterprise.
Yeah, that's really good. Some really good points there. Thanks, James. And Rose, there must surely also be some significant differences with legal risks. And the one thing that comes to my mind first is I think something that Liam brought up earlier on in the conversation, just around sort of how there can be a lot of claims coming along for a long time after an incident, or many different claims happening at the same time. What from your perspective, what do large enterprise responses have that are unique when it comes to sort of legal claims, particularly after that restoration and recovery phase, once the business is actually already back up and running?
Yeah, I think on that point, in terms of the risks coming downstream, it's less what to do with the size of the business, but more to do with potentially the sector they're in. Okay. So if they're a retailer with lots and lots of customers, then the prospect of having potential litigation or claims arising and that third-party risk arising is more likely than, say, if you were in the manufacturing industry or you were a B2B type of organization or insured. If you were reliant on a managed service provider, that brings with it a different landscape, meaning do you have a potential recovery rights against your supply chain provider or supplier if they were the one that caused the incident? So it's not necessarily linked to scale, but more the sector they're in and the likelihood that they host personal data of customers and or employees. So that is the main factor which leads to claims coming down the track. So that's something to bear in mind. Having said that, with smaller businesses, the appetite and ability to deal with such claims may vary. The willingness to and ability to engage with regulators might also vary. From a regulatory perspective, we know the ICO will treat those insurance organizations with a higher volume of data or sensitivity of data differently. So again, it goes back to the point, it's not necessarily the size, but the sensitivity of the data or the sector that you're in that will matter. So I think that's worth bearing in mind from a legal perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think we've seen a few incidents over the last year or so, particularly, again, we kind of touched on this with these managed service providers or sometimes software providers who have so many different clients, and we can often, I think, see claims coming for a long period of time. Is that something that you are seeing as well, as in like for potentially up to several months, years, we're seeing claims still being made as a result of an incident?
Yeah, that's really topical. And incidentally, I just released an article a week ago about it. And from that, it's a long-tail liability risk that we're seeing from cyber incidents. And a good example of that is the MOVEit breach, which resulted, and I think Liam touched upon this earlier in our conversation, particularly in the US. And what we're seeing is a cascade of lawsuits in the US, and with the MOVEit data breach, we're seeing what we call a multi-district litigation. And that involves litigation in multiple states. And in a 4th October decision, they consolidated more than 240 lawsuits into a singular class action. And this is one of the first few MDLs in the US, and it contributes to this long-tail liability risk. So going back to budgets, it's not just about exhausting potential limits for forensic costs, legal costs, data mining costs. How do you budget for potential litigation that may be 2, 3, 4 years down the track? How do you value settlements in a US data breach class action in the course of an MDL, which is distinct from other forms of class action? And so that real uncertainty, we're seeing it more and more. We've already seen it with the BIPA litigations in Illinois, Pixel litigation in the US. And so I think it is going to be a continuing theme, and we're only going to see more of it.
Thanks. Liam, any thoughts from you on that topic?
I completely echo everything Rose has said. And you've only got to look, this is kind of where that sort of horizon scanning comes in, and you look at the sort of what's down the track. And as Rose said, how do you budget for something that's going to be 3-4 years down the track? It's something that, you've only got to look at BIPA, who saw, that judgment coming in through the Supreme Court last year, saying that every time you scan your fingerprint, that constitutes a separate violation. So overnight, that judgment turned class action, say, of 100,000 individuals with a singular violation per individual to now potentially hundreds of thousands, depending on how many times each individual scanned their fingerprint. So the costs exponentially grew overnight. It's a scary thought, and I'm glad the sort of US legal system is taking a bit of a taking stock of that one and looking to amend the legislation to say that it's no longer going to be every time you scan your fingerprint, because it just makes settling those types of cases almost you want to get it out as quickly as possible, and it's how quickly can you settle.
How do you as an insurer look to sort of close close your files on these sort of long-winded, long-tailed incidents?
I think from a case where there's active litigation, it's purely a waiting game. I think, and it also depends on your attachment point on either the policy or the program. If you're sitting on a high excess layer, well in excess of say 200 million, then you might be safer to close your file. But honestly, I think that there's a lot of carriers out there now going, we probably need to keep these files open for a good 2-3 years.
That's really interesting. All right, I think that brings us up to time. I just want to say thanks again to Liam and Rose for joining us today. It's been so fantastic speaking to you. And I really look forward to seeing you guys in person again.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Well, James, I mean, that was a really interesting conversation. It's so great to to have Rose and Liam join us. It was I found it extremely interesting.
Yeah, very insightful to hear from them there.
Well, as we say goodbye, it's the week of the Xywave Awards, and SRM has been nominated for Incident Response Team of the Year. We actually won the award last year, so hopefully we can hold on to that trophy. And our good friends at Clyde Co, where Rose is a partner, have also been nominated for the Cyber Law Firm of the Year. And Liam's firm, Munich Re, have been nominated for Reinsurer of the Year. So if you haven't cast your votes yet, please do. It'd be great if you could cast a vote in our favor, as well as our good friends who joined us today. Otherwise, have a great week.
We are SRM. Search your first call to find out more.